Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 63rd episode of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. My name is Matthew. I'm one of your hosts.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm also one of your hosts.
And today we are going back to one of our favorite shows, favorite recent show. We're going to be talking once again about the Orville. Kind of funny, we were actually planning to do this show last time, and we wound up audibling into that show that I hope from what I can see already, a lot of folks really enjoyed, about Babylon 5. And it's kind of perfect in a way because both the Orville and Babylon 5 are very clearly deeply influenced by Star Trek. Babylon 5, I think, in a lot of ways is trying to be somewhat different than Trek, whereas Orville is, I think, the most Star Trek show we've had in a long time, and that, to me, I'm thinking it's a lot more Star Trek in either Enterprise or Discovery. But either way, Orville, I think, is a really good thing for us to be talking about, and especially we're going to be talking about the last episode of season 1. It was the one we didn't talk about on our first Orville show, and it's an episode that is so rich and has so much going on in it that we really wanted to kind of do a deep dive on it. So Jacob, why don't you start? Can you give kind of just like a brief summary of that episode for anyone who hasn't seen it? And I will say again at the beginning, we'll obviously be spoiling everything from the episode. Jacob's about to do exactly that. But, so if you want to pause it and go watch it, great. But also, if you're the sort of person who, even if you haven't seen it, you're still interested in the ethical questions it raises, hopefully, gonna go ahead and keep on listening, and we'll kind of fill you in on everything that's happening and bring you right into the discussion. So, Jacob, what's kind of happening in this episode?
So we're talking about the season finale for season 1 of the Orville. Mad Idolatry is the title, and
Thank you.
this deals with the Prime Directive, which is not what they call it in the Orville, but it deals with the ramifications of interacting with an underdeveloped culture in ways that can then influence that culture. And basically, it's like what the episode does is it tries to give you like a demonstration, an example of what this can do to a people and why you have these stories where these advanced civilizations have these kinds of rules. Basically, what happens in the episode is they encounter this planet that's doing weird stuff, where it shows up, the planet's there, and the planet's gone, and the planet's there, and then the planet's gone, and they came out here to study it to figure out what's going on. Send some people down. They have some idea of what the cycle time is, so they know they're not going to like lose their people or abandon anybody. And so they send a team down to investigate, check things out. And while they are there, Kelly Grayson, first officer of the Orville, sees a group of natives, a group of native people to the planet, a group of children specifically. And while they're playing around, one of the children sees her, and then while running away, scared, falls and gets majorly injured. And this is a very technologically deficient by comparison to the culture of the Orville civilization. So the injury that this little girl sustains is probably not one they're going to be able to heal. Kelly feels understandably responsible for this, and so she goes to help the child and ends up healing the child using the equipment she has on her. The problem with this is that the child remembers her, remembers the name Kelly, and passes that on to the people who find her. Which then, what they find out is the planet shifts out, so the crew comes back up, the planet shifts out. When the planet comes back, they are several hundred years developed past that point. So what they've discovered is that as it's leaving, it's bouncing between dimensions. And the dimension it's bouncing to, time advances much more quickly there than it does in our dimension, right, in our universe. And so what happens is that civilization then develops. It's very much a a writer's dream where they get to do this, right, where they get to show you the impact of this particular event on the culture of the world as a whole. And as it turns out, a religion has formed around Kelly the healer, right? And this idea, they see some people who, there's this idea that if you do not believe in Kelly, or if you are found to, or if people believe you to be wicked, they'll injure you. And if Kelly thinks you're worthy, Kelly will heal you, right? It's very like Spanish Inquisition, Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I guess not quite like that. Like cross between that Dark Ages crusade, like very much a dark time in the civilization's history. Uh, Obviously, Kelly feels responsible for this. Mercer's having a cow because this is this is like exactly what they're supposed to try to avoid, but they were stepping in it regardless. And well, real quick, one of the things that he acknowledges is that uh, the injury, the and potentially death of that little girl also was due to their stepping in there, and this is the kind of risk they take whenever they go down to one of these planets physically. Um, when they don't know the score, when they don't know how developed a civilization is or how they're going to react. Um, it I mean, I'm gonna try to quick jump through, but not spoil the ending. One of the things they do while they're there in that part of the timeline is that Kelly ends up meeting with the Pope, basically
Mm-hmm.
the head of the religion, saying, "I am the Kelly." Like they have a statue that looks exactly like her, and she's able to go, "Look, this is clearly me. It's all just advanced technology." Gets their Pope on board, and then after they leave, the Pope gets assassinated because the people in the church want to maintain the power and control they have over the people.
And I think important to note here is that it is pretty similar to what you'd imagine kind of a Middle Ages type religion is, that there are people who are disbelievers in Kelly and they are being punished as heretics in some pretty brutal ways. And I think
Hmm.
that that's a big part of why Kelly is so horrified about this and feels the need to kind of step in and see if she can fix this.
Right. And as it turns out, even though she could start a religion with a simple action, you can't really kill one the same way, right? You can't really quash the ideas, even if you talk to the purported head of the religion, if it's got a power base established, and it makes sense, but it's sort of this object lesson, right? Within the episode that I find fascinating. Um, they flash forward again. They see that Kelly is still being worshipped as a deity. After they jump out and back in, and they're in a they've got satellites, and they're more of like a modern civilization. And what they end up doing to try to finally fix it, because the Union is having a conniption, right? They're not happy about this either. But like you can't really like the only way you can fix it is by interfering more. And they end up sending Isaac, the android, the artificial life form that is on the Orville down, because he'll be able to last for an entire however long the cycle is. It's like 700 some odd years, to see if like having a presence endure over time can finally stamp this thing out. And
Right.
so he stays there when the planet shifts to the other universe and then comes back, which leaves us with a satisfying conclusion, but not for the reasons you might think. And I think that we can save what ends up ultimately happening for a later portion of that conversation. Do you agree, Matthew, or do you want me to?
Yeah, we can get to that to be sure. But let's start with this question of, because it as we've talked about before, this show is very clearly Seth MacFarlane's love letter to Star Trek. And it is an homage to Star Trek, but in a lot of ways he's also picking up the same questions that Star Trek loved to play with and getting to play with them himself. And this is his version of the Prime Directive debate that comes up in so many questions about in so many different versions of Star Trek. So just starting from there, what do you think? What do you think of the? Let's start just in general with that. You and I having that conversation. What's your take on the Prime Directive in general?
Well, and we kind of talked about this a little bit in our last episode, right? With the Vorlons and the Shadows. Like, what is the role
Right.
of an advanced civilization in dealing with and are you supposed to go and help out if you see like a plague on some less advanced planet that's going to wipe them all out or whatever. um Honestly, there's a fine line between being uh trying to lend what we would call humanitarian aid, although in this particular context when we're talking about extraterrestrials, that term itself is kind of loaded. I don't have a better one, unfortunately, but like when I say that, I'm saying that as a very human centric idea, right? Um, so I think the line for me has to be, it makes sense to intervene if you can like prevent an extinction level event, right? If you
Right.
can stop the planet from tearing itself apart, or stop an entire species or civilization, from dying out. Um, but you do have to acknowledge that these are selection factors that exist in nature, and that sometimes, like what if a an alien race had come by when there was the Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals, right?
Right.
When that was happening back in our early history, and decided to try to save and preserve the Neanderthals, like what would have happened? Well, the
Mm.
entire course of our history gets changed from that interference, and so it's tricky because it is hard to weigh your own conscience, right? Your own desire to preserve life with this idea, well, that things die, right? And people die, and sometimes entire civilizations or entire species die over the course of nature, over the natural course. And so for me, I think that the line towed by the Federation and the Union in the Orville both are a little bit inconsistent in how they approach it. Um, I think I like the Orville slightly better because one of the things we see, and this is a very slight spoiler for you, Matthew, but one of the things we see is that in season two is that one of the Union's policies is that if a civilization reaches out and says, "Hey, is there anybody out there?" right, looking for an answer, looking to see if there's any extraterrestrials out there, or whatever their term would be, the Union policy is that they answer. Right, they come and they show up and they initiate
Yeah.
first contact, whereas the Federation is far more restrictive about that. We actually have an episode where Data, it's called Pen Pals in Next Generation. I don't know if you remember this episode or not, but of course I
A
remember it
little
because
bit.
it involves Data. There's an alien girl who he intercepts a reception a transmission from, and he ends up basically becoming like pen pals, talking back and forth with her. And Picard, like, again, gets very upset because, like, you have no idea what the technological development level of the civilization she's from is. You have no idea what her circumstances are. You have no idea if it's ethically conscionable to even make your presence known to the people of this world. Um,
And I think that's a really important distinction because I always felt like in Star Trek, they always held that the Prime Directive is so important. They never really go that far into why. I mean, they sometimes do a little bit, but like you said, it is so restrictive. And to me, I feel like that of all the different reasons that are proposed for a Prime Directive type thing, we're using that term because I don't think the Orville comes up with a specific term for this doctrine, but it's clearly the same kind of thing. The reason that made sense to me of the many Trek reasons is the idea of a culture that is not yet ready to even conceive of the possibility of alien life. Encountering alien life can do incredible damage to that culture. And that seems to be at least the main reason why the Orville folks are so concerned about it. And so I think by that definition, the idea that when a culture reaches out to the stars, that they're ready to be contacted, that to me makes a lot of sense as the line, because at the point they're doing that, they're clearly really starting to think about, is there something else out there? Could there be something else out there? In a way that experiencing something else would be a huge change, but I don't think would have the same kind of catastrophic effects. And yeah, that kind of leads into the second, because I think in the same way, I'm kind of similar to you. I think some kind of a Prime Directive makes a lot of sense. I think having it be the Prime Directive, above all others, is where I think Star Trek always kind of lost me, and where, well, but especially because since the rule seems to exist in Star Trek mostly to get broken again and again and again. Um, and I think that I kind of like the Orville's take a little bit better for that exact reason, because it seems to be a little more focused on what's the actual problem with the with the alien contact with a not as developed world, and let's examine that specific problem and how can we draw the line in regard to that.
right, and there is a line that both Star Trek and the Orville take where providing technology, right? Particularly weapons, but any kind of like, here's our stuff, here's our technology. Even like when they're doing the first contact situation, it's not a case where it's like, here, you get to have all of these fun, fancy toys now, right? It's a case of, look, like, we can share technology with you if, we feel that it will help enrich both of us and it's not going to advance you too far too quickly. But there is this idea that, you know, advanced technology is dangerous, and if a civilization is not ready for that technology, for the ramifications of that technology, it will, as you said so succinctly earlier, do more harm than good. And
Yeah.
so that idea is sort of shared by both shows, both mythologies, if you want to put it that way. And I think
And
it's
I
correct.
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with that general principle. The idea that, especially if you give a civilization the power to do something that they couldn't do before, and they don't understand, right? They don't have the capacity for like understanding the science that you're giving them, then you can uh basically you're giving them the ability to abuse it without the ability to know how to fix it when something goes wrong.
Right. And the one counterpoint, though, I think, and I think this is true for both shows. Part of my concern about this is, and it's coming out in our discussions here. We're talking about sort of where a culture is in their progression, and I think for both shows and for our discussion, there's somewhat of an assumption that a culture's technological and social and cultural development is somewhat linear, and that it's going to be different in different ways, but that they're all going to go through different stages of, superstition leading into science, leading into more science, leading into more sort of openness to different ideas, and like, and that I think certainly came out a lot of the time in Star Trek. It comes out a little bit in the Orville, and I'm not an anthropologist, and certainly we've only had one example of overall species development, so it's hard to kind of compare it to anything. But I'm not sure I agree with the idea that every culture would necessarily progress in that same kind of linear way.
Yeah, that's fair. And like, again, we can only speak from our own experience, right? Any writer's going to write what they're familiar with. But I think it is a fair criticism that these ideas do seem to be founded on the principle that, you know, eventually this society will come to these ideas or come to be able to understand these things. And so until they can, we should step away. And it sort of abandons the notion that at some point in their development they'll get there and possibly will roll back from that, right?
Yeah.
Or ignores the possibility that perhaps they do understand, but you're not going to be able to see that when you interact with them. We actually get a great example of that in Star Trek Insurrection, where there's this planet that the Enterprise comes over to, and it looks like it looks like a very simple civilization. They make fabrics and they're washing things by hand, and they have these huts they build by hand and whatnot. So it looks like a very simple low tech culture. And as it turns out, no, these people had advanced technology, the ability to go to the stars centuries ago, and chose to give it up to lead
Yeah.
simpler lives. And it's just like like, again, if you make the assumption just by what you see of a civilization's technological advancements, it actually means that there are situations where it would be ethically conscionable for you to intervene because they can be familiar with your level of technology and not like treat it as magic or develop a religion about it. But you don't know until you talk to them.
Yeah. And I think that's such a good point. And in many ways, I don't think Insurrection is one of the better Star Trek movies by any
It
regard.
isn't.
But I liked that plot line, particularly because it felt like that was somewhat the writers commenting on the past ideas of the Prime Directive. Because that is such a rejection of that Trek idea that I thought of, that I've always wondered if that was somewhat a little bit intentional.
Oh, I think it definitely was, and I agree with you. It was one of the best things to come out of that movie.
Right. So let's now go into a little bit specifically more to how does this show explore this question. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to start by looking at, there's a whole series of decisions that are made, every one of which I think could be ethically examined. And we're going to start. Well, I think this is a good time to explain how the show ends, because I think in order to really properly evaluate those decisions, we have to kind of know how things end up. Do you think that's a fair
Yeah, I
distinction?
think that's fair. Would you like me to go ahead and explain how it ends?
Yeah, why don't you give a brief description of kind of what is it that happens once they kind of reconnect with Isaac after leaving him there for so long?
I mean, I feel like you have a slight disconnection of from reality when you use the words brief and talk to me and say, tell me to talk. But I mean, sure. So they to remind everybody, when they left Isaac on the planet for the last, like, the next cycle to try to undo the damage. He's there for like 700 years or whatnot when they get back, and they are just like, when they come back, there's, spacefaring civilization with technology equivalent or possibly even better. Actually, I think better. I think they're more advanced now than the people on the Orville in terms of their technological and cultural advancement. And uh, God, I really loved how this episode ends, so I'm trying to
Yeah.
not gush about it while I just explain. But come back and they talk to Isaac and be like, "Hey, what happened?" And they reach out to the Orville, and the culture says, "Well, actually, Isaac being there didn't really solve it. Didn't really like solve the problem at all. But we worked it out ourselves, right?" And it sort of it's left this lesson, this idea that, yeah, like, the last cycle, it looks like, they had been developing nuclear weapons. There was an arms race. There was tons of pollution. It looks like they were going to destroy each other over these religious wars. And it's this brilliantly hopeful idea that reminded me of some of Roddenberry's better work, where, if you just let him be, uh, a lot of the times people will figure it out for themselves, and that's what happened with this culture. And it's, the optimist in me would love to believe that that's always going to happen, but at the
Right.
same time, I am right there with Mercer and the rest of the Orville, in wanting to do everything they can to try to undo the damage they've done before this planet tears itself apart because of Kelly showing some basic compassion.
And I think it's a really good summary, but I think there's one really important detail that you didn't hit, and I watched the show this very recently, which is that one of the things that those people say as they're kind of reconnecting with the crew of the Orville, and I'll admit the scene was very rushed, and I wish there had been more, but one of the things that those people say is
Mm,
that it's not even just that they fixed the problem of this religion, but that they recognized that, as painful as it was, that the religion had a very important role in their social and cultural development, in being a thing that sort of helped to inspire them to look to do better and to give sort of moral guidance to some extent. And that especially seemed like such a break from the Roddenberry idea, because on some level what they were saying is that religion was something that the society eventually grew out of, but that they were still able to recognize that while it had a lot of problems, it also had done a lot of social good. As well as kind of saying that if it hadn't been Kelly, there would have been something
yeah, I
else.
actually had so
And I just thought that was such an interesting take, because there, as I said, that is such a departure from the kind of Roddenberry idea of the future where we realized religion was just hokey superstition.
Yeah, I actually I had that quote pulled up. I didn't know if we wanted to go into it or not, but it is exactly that. They say our planet worshipped you as a deity for many centuries, but had it not been you, the mythology would have found another face. It's part of every culture's evolution. And that points to an idea you mentioned earlier that, like, I'm not sure you or I necessarily agree that the formation of, like, this broad, big religion that dominates a majority of the planet at every given point in time is like a thing that's necessarily going to happen for every civilization's development. But
Right.
at least what they did is they came to the conclusion that, you know, Kelly was a convenient face for the start of that religion, but something probably would have happened. Their culture, as they were saying, was like basically ready for it at that time.
Right.
It's a really interesting idea, and one that
Well,
doesn't.
so having described it, I want to make sure let's get back to the first discussions, but just we'll know sort of where things end up as we, and so let's definitely get more into that when we get to it.
Oh, sure, yeah,
So starting there, Kelly is in this culture where she is supposed to keep herself totally secret. She, someone, not even just as an act of compassion, but somewhere she feels some guilt about, a child hurts herself because she sees Kelly and is so surprised. Kelly feels an obligation to fix what happened, and that's the sort of incident where it's a clear break of their version of the Prime Directive, and has all the results that it's supposed to that you're supposed to be trying to avoid. What's your take on what she's doing there?
So, I mean, from a writing perspective, it's clearly like intended as a cautionary tale, right? And this is why we have it there. From Kelly's perspective, I like I don't think she did anything wrong. And I do think that the consequences of her actions were unfortunate. I also think that in that position, that is what you were supposed to do. If she had just seen the child like fall or injure themselves and hadn't been at least in part responsible, then I think you can make the argument that what you're supposed to do there is keep to the non-interference. Once the event happens and her presence is what instantiated it, the damage due to your presence being there has already been done, and what she does in that moment is what the crew of the Orville continues to try to do over the rest of the episode. So if she's wrong there, then every subsequent thing they try to do to fix it is also wrong, is my take. What about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I think, and here this may also be the sort of thing where a show is trying to set up a particular question but misses a little bit, because I think what the show wants you to believe is that the thing that breaks the Prime Directive is when she fixes and heals the child. But as you said, in reality, what actually happened is the child seeing her is what caused the child to be injured in the beginning. And so you could easily argue just as much that if she hadn't saved them, that instead a religion grows up about this horrible demon, Kelly, that comes and scares little children. And so I agree with you that I think the damage is already done there. But I think if you sort of take the show's conceit that it's the healing moment, it's a hard thing, because I think, to me, one of the questions that you often run into is this kind of thing of, do you save one person and do incredible damage to everyone else? And I think I've talked about this on prior episodes. Certainly I know I talked about it with Paul and probably with you. This makes for very bad movies and television, and I know what that means. And I know why that is. But on some level, I have always thought the scene where our hero ignores their commanding officer and says, I'm going to go try and save this one person, even though it puts everyone on my ship or in my community or in my planet at risk. I always have trouble finding that person being the hero. And granted, Kelly's thing is a little bit different, but I think I am. Granted, I think the end result is that the results are not as disastrous as you would think because of what we find out in the end. But I think I'm a little bit more on, I'm not sure she should have saved the kid because of that idea of the kind of larger I guess because here's the thing. In the end, I am always very concerned about people making decisions purely out of emotion. And I don't think in that moment Kelly is saying, let me actually think about what's going to be the repercussions of this event and analyzing it and coming to an ethical decision. I think she's saying, oh shit, I just caused a child to really be injured and possibly killed. I feel horribly guilty and sad about this. I want to fix this now. And I don't think it's as bad as like, this is the worst thing that anyone in the Alliance can ever do, and so there has to be their Prime Directive. But I don't think I'm on the side of that she makes the right decision.
Well, that's interesting. Well, I mean, as far as the like wanting to see somebody who defies their commanding officer actually not be painted as the hero, that's The Last Jedi, and that's why we like that movie so much. But and there's something you said there, and I 100% do not believe that you're intending it in this way. But I want to be clear that the idea that you're presenting can easily be interpreted as a defense of well, if I poison one M&M in this bowl of M&Ms, then how many of those M&Ms are you going to eat? Kind of argument. Like it has a conceit that you know for a fact that if you are Kelly, your healing of this child will do damage to this culture, and you don't actually know that, right? You do know the positive consequences of your actions will be. You do know if you take that action, the child will live, right? You can say that
Right.
with certainty, but you don't know whether you're going to do damage or not beyond that point. And I don't think, I think that it should be a consideration, but I guess I'm not sold on the idea that because your actions could have a consequence like that, it is not right to do them.
Right. No, and I understand that, and I think that's part of where we'll get to at the end of this episode is sort of by the moral calculus of Kelly's understanding at the time, at least what the Alliance teaches at the time, the understanding that it could have, catastrophic consequences is thought to be fairly certain. I think part of what the episode does is to leave us questioning that in a really important way. And that's again where I sort of feel like if Kelly had been saying, look, I don't think we should be as scared about this as everyone claims. I'm just going to heal this girl. It's a good thing. I think I would have almost even more supported that. It's in part because it doesn't seem like she weighs the moral consequences differently. It's that it seems like because of her own personal guilt, she decides not to care about the moral consequences.
I'm not sure. I'm going to push back on that. I'm not sure it's
Sure.
because she feels guilty that she does it. I think it's because of her compassion. I think it just like a lot of the Doctor characters that we see in Star Trek, where their Hippocratic oath overrides their adherence to the Prime Directive time and time again. I think
Right.
to me it felt like that. That she wasn't trying to do it just to salve her conscience. She's trying to do it because I think she did think it was the right thing to do in that moment. And when Mercer and Kelly talk about it afterwards, she, I think she's very clear about that. It's been a
Right.
while since I've seen the episode, so unfortunately I can't say for certain that that's what happens. But
Yeah. No, I definitely get what you mean, and I think that it's an important distinction, and I think it's hard to kind of talk about.
I mean, and I don't. It's not. Don't get me wrong. It's not that I completely disagree with your point of view either. I think you raised some very valid ethical points. One of the reasons we like this episode so much is that the questions are hard, right? It's not
Yeah.
easy. It's not. There's no definite answer. I don't think we can say that Kelly was necessarily right or wrong. I know what I believe, but I'm not even 100% sure that that what I believe is right. Right?
It's funny because I was thinking as we did our last episode on Babylon 5 and the Vorlons and the Shadows, I think that was a very good episode, and we talked about a lot of great things. But at the end, part of what we were talking about is what a great job that show did of giving an answer to a difficult ethical question. But the show didn't actually leave you with many questions about that. Like by the end of the show, it's pretty clear where the Vorlons and the Shadows stand and where everything is. And I don't think many people would disagree with many of the conclusions we came to on that episode. Whereas here, this is very different. As you just said, this is much more in the like Team Cap or Team Tony thing, where I think a lot of people could watch this show and come to different perspectives on what Kelly should have done, which to me is what a good sci-fi show really should do.
Mm-hmm.
So let's move on to the next discussion, which is where one of the things that happens next is that Ed covers for her, and because the part of the implication is that there is a possibility that, and probably wouldn't be able to happen because of the way the culture evolves and things like that. But there would be a possibility of the Alliance, which is the version of the Federation in the show, basically fixing what Kelly did. And they never get a chance because Ed flat out lies about it and doesn't tell anybody else what happened. And so it doesn't give anyone else the chance to try and intervene and fix things. What's your take on his decision?
Oh boy, yeah. So I was hoping we were going to talk about Ed omitting her actions, because she tells him straight up, right, which is 100% ethically sound, saying, "Look, I screwed up here. I violated some of our," and what Ed does, because Ed is, and this I do think is at least in part because of emotion, but also part because he's trying to protect his crew. Right, it's very much for the listeners of the show. Matthew and I have been watching The Wire recently. Rather, Matthew's been showing me The Wire, and so it's very similar to the whole you protect your people, the cops protecting the people in their unit, even when what the people in their unit did was wrong. Right. Thinking about what the lieutenant does with Prespaluski. And if you haven't seen the show, I apologize for saying a bunch of nonsense that you didn't understand. God, we should do an episode on that at some
We
point
really
coming up.
should.
But anyway, so there is an element to that, but if you ask me in this case whether Ed is correct in omitting that very important fact about what they could have done to this culture from his report to the Union, I think it's 100% wrong. He should not have done that. I
Yeah.
understand why he did it, but I very much disagree with that decision.
And I think so too. And in many ways, because I think that would be, if I was going to argue for how to relax the Prime Directive, I think one of the first things I would say is like, look, be aware that first contact situations, if handled badly, could have severe consequences. And so be ready to deal with those consequences in the moment to prevent them from getting much worse. And I think Kelly knows that. And I think part of why Kelly tells him is specifically for that reason, so that something can be done to try to solve this. And I think what Ed does there is, again, very understandable because he's covering for his crew person, but I think there it's the putting the emotion ahead of the larger situation.
And here, because he is in love with his first officer, and that's his
Yeah.
ex-wife, and there's a lot of emotional baggage there. So there, I think, like, I agree with your argument that there is a clear emotional, not really rational decision. Although, and so this is another part of it, is that if the consequences for this kind of violation weren't so stark, I mean, they make it very clear that like this could be the end of Kelly's career for doing this, if I recall correctly, and that's too much, right? For something like this, that means that nobody's ever going to cop to it, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that means it incents the commanding officer who wants to keep his people loyal to do exactly what Mercer did and cover for him. So in some ways, uh, God, this is terrible, but in some ways, Mercer is kind of a victim of the system because he's put into that position in the first place where he has to choose between potentially the career of a very fine officer in the Union and,
Yeah.
reporting something that might not be a big deal. They don't even know at that point if it's a big deal yet.
And that's something that I think can be, I mean, that's a whole other discussion we can have another time, but I think you're right. There is a very interesting question there about what level of discipline can you do before you get to a point where you actively discourage people from reporting problems for fear of that discipline. But so let's now move on to the next major decision, because I do want to make sure we get through all of this, and we can't go too much longer. But where Kelly tries to speak to, again, what you said is effectively the Pope. They don't call him that, but he has an outfit that is very reminiscent of a Middle Ages papal figure. He speaks to the crowds from a balcony and is referred to as sort of the Holy Father and things like that. I don't think they use that exact term, but something like it. And Kelly tries to say, look, all these truths that the religion is based on are false. You can't do this. And then the Pope believes her at first, and then is killed by by his sort of second in command. What's your take on how all that played out?
Well, so the actual conversation with the Pope at that point, remember this all happens like we get Kelly saving the girl, we get Ed covering for her, and under normal circumstances, they wouldn't see these kinds of ramifications until the people involved on the Union side of it were well past dead, right?
Right. Yeah, this is 1,500 years later.
Right, and this is so this is not something that they would normally have had to wrestle with, which is another reason I really love this episode, because it presents questions and challenges that you would never get and you can't get outside of science fiction.
It does what I think science fiction does best, which is to say, let's take an existing question, put it into a completely fanciful hypothetical, and ask how does that change the question.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But so what do you think of Kelly's decision here?
Well, so talking to the established religion about like, hey, look, you can't do this in my name. I'm not even a real god. Like, woof. I mean, basically, that would be like, I don't have a good analog, but like I don't think it's wrong. I don't think it's right either. I think it's what she had to do, right? And I think that she was sort of boxed in because the only right thing to do there is to try to lessen the damage, and here that means like taking the lesser of two evils. Like, saying, nope, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to disprove. I'm going to prove to you that like I am the idol that you've started to worship, and that I am not what you think I am, in order to stop the damage that the religion that is formed around my idea is now doing. Like, it's tough, but I
Mm-hmm.
think that that's what she's supposed to do. I think it's in that real ethical gray area, because there's a lot of problems with going in as an advanced civilization and saying, here's why your religion is hogwash. Uh,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
Matthew hasn't
and I
seen
think
the last two Orville episodes, so anybody who's listening who wants to talk about that specifically, wait a couple of weeks.
yeah, no spoilers for that. But yeah, I think you're right, and honestly, I think this is, I said I'm not really thrilled with Kelly's decision to heal the girl. I definitely think Kelly is wrong here because I think, and in some ways, I think the ending of the show especially kind of gets to this, but it's something that I think you see a lot. Whether or not a religion is right or wrong, I mean, that whole question makes no sense. But whether, if a religion that is being based on, you know, beliefs that are clearly provably false, I think we're dealing with this in our own world. Going in and telling those people, even in some way, quote unquote, proving it, it doesn't work.
Hmm.
Even if you can convince one or two people, those people, the beliefs like that become so deeply ingrained as part of the culture that it's just so easy to just completely reject any attempt to do that. And I think we're seeing that now, and the lengths that people will go to ignore any evidence of global warming or evolution or that homosexuality isn't sinful or any of these things. Um, I'm not saying that we don't need to keep continuing to help people understand how wrong those beliefs are, but I think that part of what we see is that to just go in and say, look, I know more than you, I'm right, clearly you're wrong, change everything today, is not only ineffective, but in many ways harmful because it makes people kind of double down on things. And it makes people, like, now that their beliefs are threatened, there's now so much more of a push to defend those beliefs. And the episode didn't say this, and I'm kind of headcanning a little bit, but the world that they show us that's the equivalent of our modern day world, religion plays a much bigger part in the catastrophes of that time than it does even in our own world, which is hard to imagine because religion plays some pretty awful roles here. But it seems like it plays a much bigger role, and I'm headcanoning here, but I think part of the implication was supposed to be that that whole incident kind of like redoubled the need for people to defend the religion. And I sort of wonder, that person who kills the Pope and takes over, does he now sort of shift the church a little bit towards, and we must remember that there will be false prophets who claim to be Kelly and claim to think that they're right, and we must destroy them in all ways. I've kind of gone off on a long rant there, but I definitely feel like religion is such an ingrained part of culture that it is easy for those people who are not religious, and especially those who think of themselves as more sort of scientific, and thus that religion is hokey, which a belief that I can very much understand and respect, but that it's easy to therefore kind of think of religion as something that can be very easily dismissed and very easily fixed. I think part of what this episode gets to is just how wrong that is.
And that's a really good point, and I mean, as you say, the episode sort of like gives that lesson too, that like even if you go in there and say, look, I am your god and I am not actually your god, it won't really fix anything, or it most likely won't fix anything because you can't change a culture with a single speech. That's something that like we love to believe that in our stories, that like one set of words said at the right time to the right people in the right moment will change the world. The reality is that the like our culture certainly doesn't work that way. Why would anybody else's? So I think that's a really good point that you're raising. I have a quick hypothetical for you. I know that we're pressed for time, but how would you have felt about it if instead of doing what she did, which is say, look, your religion is wrong, if she had instead played the role, right, and then
Yeah.
used it to try to guide. So like basically, if she assumed the role of the Vorlons, and tried to just guide them, nudge them in the right direction of, hey, just killing people for not believing in me. That's not what I'm about. Uh, it, like I have opinions, but I'm curious. What would you think about that instead?
I think, I think, I definitely think that the approach should have been to try to, in a much more subtle way, deal with things. And that they're very limited because of the fact that they only are there for 13 days.
Mm-hmm.
Like, ideally you spend sort of 5 years going around and like talking to one person and talking to someone else and letting those ideas kind of spread naturally and organically. I think something like that might have made sense. I think again because I think the general idea I think there has to be, once that religion has taken hold so much, you can't just undo the religion. What you have to do is find a way to speak to people in that context to guide the religion to being something less destructive and more ready to evolve into what it becomes. And so, yeah, I think that could have been a way to do it. I think, writing some texts that could be discovered that are, letters from there's 8 million ways you could do it. And of course, there's a danger of like, are you reifying the religion or are you kind of helping them move past it? But I think something like that, again, could have been done that would be a lot more effective than just walking in, oh, by the way, I'm Kelly, everything you believe is wrong.
Yeah, and I don't disagree about the potential efficacy. I do think that would have been massively more ethically wrong, ethically problematic to do.
Interesting.
Because, well, here's the thing: that's that's mass cultural manipulation, right? Is what you're effectively doing in that situation, right? You're not. I mean, technically, you are playing God, right? Just not in the way that we think of it when we use that phrase. And I think
Right.
that, like, assuming a role that, like, you know yourself to be false just to get people on your side, it's just, I don't know, to me it just feels very dishonest. uh
Mm-hmm.
i I agree with you that it probably would have been more effective to do that. And actually, the next point, when Kelly offers to go back, that's what they're proposing, is like to try to just influence the cultural zeitgeist over time, and see if we can get them to get on board with a better way of approaching life, etc., and a better life's philosophy. But, like, for whatever reason, and I don't know if this is because of my own personal beliefs, but it just, to me, feels so much worse to go in there and to pretend to in any way pretend to be something you're not, or like write up religious text to be found, to
Right.
manipulate these people to think into doing what you think they should do. And I think that's the problem I have with it, is that basically what you're trying to do is force a people to believe what you want them to believe.
Right. So, and I will say, I think I completely agree with you there. I think the thing is that I don't know if that's any more emotionally manipulative than what she does.
Fair.
Because she is still just as much trying to, um, she is just as much trying to manipulate the entire society. She's just trying to do it by changing the person at the head of it, in a different kind of a way.
Yeah.
So let me actually put my own hypothetical on it to you. What if they come across this culture that has this deeply problematic religion that has nothing to do with Kelly? That's just a religion that they, came up with entirely on their own. That is, in a kind of crusades-like way, doing a lot of terrible things.
I don't know, Matthew. Maybe watch the episode that showed up 2 weeks ago, and we can talk about that later.
Well, okay. So again, it's hard for you because you can't spoil it, but because to me,
They literally
I would say,
cover it, so like I can't speak in hypotheticals. That is literally what happens.
Okay, well, and maybe that's an interesting kind of counterpoint to this episode. But where I would go with it, and I maybe you can approach it just from this hypothetical perspective, is, to my mind, on some level, yes, there is an emotional response. Yes, there is sort of a responsibility for the situation that happened.
Mm-hmm.
But if you would be able to look at that culture and say, this religion is terrible and is doing terrible things, but our Prime Directive says we don't interfere, I feel like whether or not you caused the religion to start, I don't know if it changes the question enough to be relevant. I sort of feel like either way, because you're right, it is so incredibly manipulative. And, can you manipulate people to fix a problem that you started by unintentionally manipulating them?
Yeah.
I don't know, does it change the moral character of it?
I think that's a very good point. The idea that like if you encounter it and you didn't have a hand in its creation at all, does it change the question? That's an excellent question. I don't
Yeah.
think it does. But I like again, I have a slightly different perspective, sort of this absolutist perspective, if you will. But like, I don't think it does. I think it's the same question. Like, it's either you want to help the civilization or you don't, right?
Right.
If you think that they're doing damage to themselves over time, that they've got some cultural practice that is just like look at what they did with the Mocklins, right? Where they brought basically Mocklin culture on trial and tried to make a case for why this portion of their culture was wrong. They've already kind of
Right.
shown us that at least from the Orville crew's perspective, they're willing to sit here and challenge aspects of a culture they don't agree with. Um,
Yeah.
but they would probably meet it on those terms, right?
And I think that there's something very dangerous about that. I think
Mm-hmm.
we talked about that when we talked about the Mocklin culture. There's something very colonialist and very imperialist about we think that our culture is better than yours, and so we are going to try and change your culture. And there again is I think a reason why the Prime Directive type thing is important because it tries to prevent that kind of thing. Um, like I'm
Absolutely.
thinking just in our own world, and she gets kind of singled out a bit too much, and so I don't want me to just single out Eve Ensler for what I'm about to talk about because others did this as well. Eve Ensler, the woman who wrote the Vagina monologues, shortly after that was a huge success, very publicly announced and did work on the idea that her next crusade was going to be to eliminate female genital mutilation in Africa. One of the major areas where it takes place, and I mean, she was looking to eliminate it in anywhere in the world, but she was mostly focusing on Africa. And I think an incredibly laudable goal, but she was doing it very much from an outside, that I, as an outsider of American background, am going to try and go and talk to Africans about why their culture is wrong without any real understanding of the culture. And it backfired in 8 million ways for all the reasons you could imagine. And to me, that's again what I'm kind of seeing here is the religion is obviously really harmful, but I just don't see how any attempt to fix that is not going to have even worse consequences.
Yeah, and basically like and we talked about this at the time too. We talked about this during our last episode on Orville. It's like this show just keeps bringing these questions up, man.
Yeah.
But this like if you march into a room and say your culture is wrong, you are very unlikely to get any traction.
Yeah.
And yet that's exactly what Kelly did in this scene. Like she has great intentions, right? The best of intentions, but it is the same kind of thing. And I agree that the like you have to enter into it. Like, look, there's still situations where people are doing things that are like I believe completely morally wrong, right? But
Mm-hmm.
you can't enter into the conversation, right? You won't be part of the conversation if you don't make it a conversation, I guess, is what I'm
Right.
trying to say. And that's really tricky, especially if something is like to you just completely morally unconscionable. You can't fathom how people come to this conclusion, right? But especially when we're dealing with these alien cultures in these science fiction worlds, we have no context for the civilization's history and development, right? We don't know how they came to these conclusions. We don't know anything about their culture, their beliefs, how ingrained this is into their society. Uh, so, like again, as you rightly pointed out, you can't just walk into a room and say, "Nope, you're wrong. Please stop."
Yeah. And like I said, like you said, it's what is so good about the show because I also don't want to go that far on the other end.
Right.
Like on all these questions, I don't want to just say like female genital mutilation, totally fine. It's their culture, it's their practice. Nothing wrong with that. It's something that strikes me as horrific, and I think strikes a lot of people as horrific for very good reasons. I understand why Kelly thinks what is happening on this planet is so horrific, and so in ways like that. And so I don't think that any of this is an argument to say like, let the other cultures be and do whatever their own thing, as much as just that it is a question of simply believing that something else is wrong. You can't, that there's so much more complexity to deciding whether or not to act on that or how to act on that or all that kind of thing because the possibilities of colonialism and imperialism and imposing your culture on a different culture without any understanding of the context just makes no sense whatsoever. Which is why, and I think, like, you know, one of the things that I think is often a response to that is that the better way to achieve cultural change is not to, as the outsider, come in and try to do it, but as the outsider to try to find insiders who believe that same thing and try to encourage them and support them in them finding the best way to change their own culture. Mm-hmm. And that leads into, because I think to some extent that's what Kelly wants to do when she offers to go back and stay there for the rest of her life, and that Isaac winds up doing instead.
Right.
What's your take on that perspective?
So, I mean, Kelly offering to go back, that is a big sacrifice, and it's a really big acknowledgement of, you know, her hand in this, like, she's taking ownership of the consequences of her actions, even though, like, she really drew a bad lot on this one, right? Like, this could have broken so many different ways, and, like, it really feels like, especially at this point in the episode, that she just drew the absolute worst possible scenario. And so, like, but it's still, like, it's really big to be all like, you know what, the rest of my natural life is worth trying to help this culture, help these people out of this problem that I've had some hand in generating. I don't think she would have offered to do it if she hadn't been the inciting incident, right? If that hadn't been her, which does sort of separate it from some of the other cultures or belief systems that they're encountering that they might have problems with, right? Because nobody's offering that big of a sacrifice at any point. But I think, like, it's earned. And I feel like it's too big of an ask as well. Like, I feel like even though she's willing to do it, I think that it is well above and beyond what anybody can reasonably be expected to do. I think in this particular situation, it's less about whether it's ethically problematic, ethically right or wrong. I think correct me if I'm wrong, I think we both think that approach that she's willing to take is, like, the best thing that she can do once we get to that point. But it's more about, like, is it reasonable to expect somebody to do that and to make that big of a sacrifice? And I just, well,
especially because, and it's funny that I keep hitting on the same issue, and I don't know why I'm so thinking about it today, and particularly this episode. But there again, it feels like Kelly's primary motivation is it's compassion, but it is also the guilt. Like, it's not, you know, I think the fact that the one person who really wants to volunteer to do this is the person who feels directly responsible, I don't think is coincidental. And I agree with you. I feel like I don't know if it's a sacrifice that would make sense, and I think that it is, as we've said, kind of, if you are hell-bent on changing this in some way, that would be the most effective. But you're right, it is not even asking because she's the one to offer, but I think it's too much to make her do or to let her do, especially when it seems like, I think this really comes out in her acting, it's a great acting job. She's motivated by compassion, but also just that sense of responsibility. Not even maybe guilt, but responsibility. Mm-hmm. That this is something that I did, so I need to fix it.
Yep. Yeah. And, like, here I completely agree with you that, like, and it's not that I think that like, I don't question that particular motivation. I don't think that's worse than, like, I don't believe that people should just do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, right? If you do the right thing because you feel guilty, fine. I care about your actions, not your motivations, in that particular case. In other cases, as we've talked about, sometimes I care about your motivations too. But if you're doing the right thing, then, and it's a sacrifice like that, your motivations are less important to me.
So let me now tee up the question that I think you'll love to talk about. Isaac winds up being the one to do it, and they do try to talk him out of it a little bit, but he makes pretty clear, look, because I'm a robot, I can live that entire time, I'm not gonna die, and I'm not gonna get bored, I'm not gonna be bothered by, he basically says, look, since I have no emotions and no feelings, I won't be troubled by doing this very weird thing for the next 50,000 years, or 1,000 years, whatever it is. As the resident robots are people too person, What's your take on that?
At bots are people too on Twitter. Follow me
Yes.
if you like. But if Isaac had not volunteered, I would be very upset about this episode rather than loving it so much. Um, in some ways, I actually feel like this was a really good moment for Isaac because
Hmm.
it was his like, here's something only I can do. And prior to this episode, I feel like Isaac had been mostly portrayed as very self-interested, right? Like he's there to study and learn about these like weird fleshy creatures and stuff, and it's that very like detached robot thing that we get a lot in
Right.
media, and it's mostly played for comic relief, and I very much dislike it. But here he identifies I'm the right candidate for this because nobody actually has to give anything up. Um, and I can do this, and so I am the logical choice. I am the right choice for this. Um, it's convenient that they happen to have an artificial life form that was capable of
Yep.
doing this. But like, I can't, I can't fault the writers for utilizing something that they established in episode 1 and episode 13. I'd be a monster if I did that. Uh,
Right.
so it's but I think it shows a rare for Isaac, especially at that point in the series, it shows a rare amount of I don't want to say compassion because I don't think that that Isaac processes things the same way that you or I do. I don't think that he
Hmm.
has the level of emotional intelligence that you or I do, but I think he starts to understand what what these collaborative beings do in these situations, and that this is something that needs to happen. And I think that he also understands that like this is a problem that needs to be solved, and that it is important enough for him to do this. And
Yeah.
I just like there were a lot of ways they could have wrapped this up that would have made me not okay with it. I was 100% okay with Isaac going down and trying to be the perpetual influence to slowly see if we could shift the culture.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way of phrasing it because it the big it's a nice way of in Star Trek, Data is constantly trying to be human. But the ways in which he is not human are often portrayed as, a fault and things that he feels bad about. Even though he can do things that everyone else can do, that no one else can do. And they play with this a little bit with Data, but I think here they're going even further with Isaac of showing here's something that he can do that no one else can do. And so here's a way where his a way that his being so different is actually a huge advantage and not a drawback in him being less than human.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and again to hit on that point that I keep going to, the fact that I think you were saying this for him, it is a completely dispassionate position. I don't think he doesn't have any compassion. He doesn't have any. His life, his existence, isn't affected in any way whatsoever, whether or not this planet develops in one way or another. And so to play out that way, I think it was just a really nice way to play with this idea of sort of the role of artificial life in these things.
Right, and that you could come to, I like that they portrayed that you can come to the logical conclusion that this should be done without having any emotional investment in it. Because that's again kind of a hopeful idea, right? That pure, quote unquote, pure reason that a lot of geeks sort of sometimes worship at the altar of, which is a little bit problematic in and of itself. But that
Yeah.
can come to this, the idea that that can come to this same conclusion that we need to repair the culture, we need to help this planet not kill itself, um, is just a beautiful notion.
Yeah. So what's your take on where it ends up? And that we talked about it some already, but let's kind of circle back. That conversation that the episode ends with about um them being told, like, look, you weren't really able to fix this problem, but the problem shifted and grew and evolved till it wasn't a problem anymore, and on some levels wasn't a problem, and that it was actually a help. What's kind of your take there?
I feel like this is the show writers trying to give a message of hope to us in our culture right now. That's how I interpreted it at the time. Is like, look, some messed up stuff is happening. It's part of any civilization's growing pains, and we'll move past it and we'll get over it, just like this civilization did. Even though like it seems very bleak, and it seems like, you know, we're two steps away from completely destroying ourselves and the world around us. Um, I love the idea. I really want it to be true. I don't know if it is, and I don't know if it is. Um, while I love the hopeful message, my one criticism of it is that I'm not sure it is completely responsible to send a message like that in a piece of science fiction when we know full well right now that we should be alarmist about what we're doing to our planet specifically.
Right. Well, so let's break this down because I feel like there's two major points that are made in that last scene. The first point of which is religion and superstition and the harm it's done, a cultural will naturally evolve past it. And the second is that religion, for all of its kind of dangers and hurts, and that eventually you need to grow past it, does have some helpful developmental effects on a society and culture. So I think they're related, but two different questions.
Yeah,
It sounds like what you're talking about there is the answer to the first one, that it sounds like would like the idea to think that we'll grow past those things, but you're not sure, and you're concerned that it might be dangerous to even kind of push the idea that we will.
yeah, and like I think those 2 points are sort of tied part and parcel together, right? But they are different, and like I do like the idea of sort of illustrating that, look, not everything to do with religion is bad. It can really help. It can really help change and grow people and grow a culture, etc. And so the idea that like, and as you rightly criticized Star Trek for, oftentimes in Star Trek we got this sort of very broad strokes, all religion is bad and they're all false gods and it's people manipulating people and that's all it ever is. And I did like the message that, look, not everything that comes out of religion is a bad thing.
Right.
Even though I am not myself a follower of any particular religion, I don't like, I just don't subscribe to the idea that it's all evil.
Right. Yeah, well, and again, I think that's getting a little into the second question. Just on the first one, I definitely hear where you're coming from in terms of the concern and then not sure it's there. And here again, I kind of wish this was a two-parter because I would have loved to actually get to see more of what happens on that planet while Isaac is there. Because my, again, kind of headcanon is that the culture goes through a moment kind of like what is happening in our culture today, where you have a whole spectrum of some people who are holding on to the most fundamental beliefs of the religion and refusing to accept anything else. Other people for whom the religion is kind of a social and community thing, and sometimes it's very hypocritical, and sometimes it's just a nice place to, take your kids on a Sunday or a Friday night. And then you have some people who are trying to really push to reform religions and to change them and to make them less, horrible. And then a lot of people who've rejected the ideas entirely. And I'm kind of, I guess I'm imagining that that's the direction that this society goes through. But again, we don't know because we just don't see it because there's not enough time in the episode. And I guess I kind of feel like I'm close to where you are, but maybe in a little more hopeful way, which is that I think you're right. I don't necessarily think that a religion would ever be completely pushed out of a culture. And by the way, other people know that if you've been listening for a while, you know this about me, but I should say as full disclosure, I am myself a religious person. I'm very much one of those super liberal Christian types that I just talked about, but I have been I've worked professionally in the church for a number of years. I don't anymore, but I still am connected to those worlds. So obviously I have a distinct bias in this discussion. But I guess, and who knows where things are going to go. And especially because in some ways we're seeing a real revamping of fundamentalism. In many of the world's religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, we're seeing it come back in a lot of ways. And I think I guess here's where I would agree with you is I think the process of moving away from superstition and fundamentalism is, I think, a process that will happen, but I don't think it just naturally happens. I think it happens because people fight to make it happen and people really work hard to change these cultural beliefs from inside the culture. And I think if I have any hope that's going to happen, it's more like that kind of thing. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, yeah, and I can get behind that. And like, I agree with you that I feel like if we had had more time, right, in the episode, to explore something like that and see the change rather than just being told, kind of like, and it didn't feel super cheap, right? It was still really good. And I remember leaving the episode feeling very, very good because I like it was
Oh
just this
yeah.
incredibly hopeful message about the future. Um, and it's hard to look at that and be, at least for me, and be all like, yeah, whatever, world's bad. But but
Oh yeah, and to be clear, I'm not saying I thought it was a bad ending. I think it was a fantastic ending that I just wished we'd had a lot more
no,
of.
exactly, and I'm saying that I agree with you that if we had gotten that like sort of view into the world, at least like maybe even just like a clip show of Isaac down on the planet interacting with culture at different points in time and seeing like the culture themselves like slowly progress and change and grow to a point where they could unify their understanding of their world and their understanding of their religion and everything without having these, without having to go to war over like differences in beliefs, etc. Um,
Right.
I would have liked to see that more natural progression. Of course, like the whole conceit of the episode is we get to cheat a thousand years here or there in development and not see any of it.
Right.
So of course, like, why would the last scene be any different? But like, that's the one where I really wanted the microscope. But then we're asking the writers to basically show us how we're going to solve our own problems right now, and like, if they knew, they'd be doing it. So
Right. No, I think that's definitely true. And so what do you think about the second point of that question? This conceit that even a religion such as the Church of Kelly, where we saw the horrible parts and the destruction and the people being killed and the cultural problems, them kind of turning around at the end saying, overall, the Church of Kelly seemed to be a good thing for us, and it helped us develop in ways that if it wasn't Kelly, something else would have been.
So there is you can look back at our history actually for a great example of this very idea. At least in the Western world, the start of many of the scientific disciplines came from the church, right? And it's this idea where curiosity about the world around you can be inspired, is often sparked by belief or by wanting to know more about the creation or about God or what have you. And so like I very much like that was something I really liked, the idea that it lit the spark, it lit the match of maybe there's more to our world than we realize, than what's right in front of us. And that, being the catalyst for, them exploring more about their world, learning about their world, learning science and art and industry later on, etc., all being sort of catalyzed by the formation of this particular religion, or by the congregation of people, right, around this
Right.
one idea where there's now this um, shared viewpoint where that can serve as a binding point to share ideas, which can help a culture grow. Like, again, that is literally what has happened on our planet, and I like that they didn't. I love that the show writers chose to sort of bring that idea out, and they did not do it in as many words, but that's sort of what I came away from it with, and I agree with and like that they chose to do that.
Yeah. And I think I feel the same way. And again, I have a very distinct bias. Obviously, I think today that even with all the problems religion has, that it can do some good, and that's why I'm part of the institution. And I don't even think that Seth MacFarlane was saying that he definitely agrees with that as much as I would. But I think he was doing something so interesting because that's a perspective you almost never see in science fiction, especially not huge media science fiction. It comes up a lot in some science fiction writing. Um, but Trek itself, as we said at the beginning, the conceit is always religion is bad and it has to be fixed. Um, and so I did like this perspective just as a nice counterpoint to that, to say here, and that you don't have to say that this is true for all societies, and it might not be true for our own society here on Earth. Here on Earth, you could easily say religion has overall been a bad thing. But just presenting one culture where they could say, maybe here it wasn't a bad thing, even if there was a lot of bad parts to it, or even not even that it means it's overall a good thing, but just that it's a thing that was going to happen some way or another anyway. And so trying to overall decide is it good or bad isn't really important. We just understand how we developed past it. And I think that's a really interesting take on it all.
Yeah, for more of religion in science fiction, see Jakar's entire storyline post season 3 in Babylon 5.
Yes.
But that's
Babylon 5 actually I think is a very good show that in a counterpoint to that also shows both the bad and the good of how religion can play in. I also want to mention, just because whenever I get a chance to get a dig in at Robert Heinlein, I like to take it. The discussion we were having before about sort of the danger of people who think they're better than religion, using religion to manipulate people. Spoilers for this book, so if you want, skip ahead 60 seconds if you haven't read Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Spoiler warning, take your time. I hate that book for so many reasons, but this is one of the biggest. Because I don't know if you've read it, it is a book about a group of people who are, in a very Heinlein tradition, they believe that all the people who aren't as smart as them are making dumb decisions, and they know what's best for all those people. And if the people were just smart enough to listen to these folks, they would do what is right, but they won't listen to these folks, so they create a religion to make the people believe in instead. And I haven't read the book in a long time. I think what it has done is that, like, basically a computer is what's figuring it all out, but they make it seem like the computer is a religious figure. Anyway, I don't want to get into a long thing about that, but that's just another example, I think, of what you were talking about where even when it's for the best of intentions, when it's super smart people trying to use religion in this kind of way to manipulate others, it gets real bad. So I think we've kind of, we had a couple other sort of wrap-up questions that we've actually hit pretty well. Are there any kind of closing thoughts you have before we start to wrap this up?
So for the most part, like, if you enjoyed the show but didn't actually watch every episode of season 1, for sure, watch Mad Idolatry. It is far and away the best episode of the first season, and is what got me to sign on to, okay, definitely watching season 2, probably watching this show until it dies, because it showed me what the kinds of questions that they're willing to tackle, and how they're willing to tackle them, how deep they're willing to go. And then look forward to our episode on All the World is Birthday Cake, coming probably in a month or so. That's the name of season 2, episode 5, which is the one that I keep referencing sidelong in the podcast. But like, it's gonna.
I may push that we're not going to be quite there in a month, just because we've now done a lot of little more obscure science fiction television. But I think we will definitely get to it at some point, because this is such a good show that raises so many things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think I don't really have any other closing thoughts there. I think we hit a lot of the stuff that's interesting. I would just say, as always, we've raised some really great questions. I want to know what you think. I know Jacob wants to know what you guys think. Jacob actually realized last time that there was an issue about the Vorlons and Shadows that he hadn't brought up, and so we posted it on Twitter, and he and I got to have a good Twitter conversation there. These are great ways to interact with us, and there's now a couple of more things you can do. First of all, as always, you can find us on Twitter and on Facebook at Superhero Ethics. Those are the main accounts for the page itself and the podcast itself, and we'll always respond there. Also, if you want to correspond with us directly, both Jacob and I are on Twitter. I am on Twitter at Caped Ethicist, CAPED ETHICIST. Caped Ethicist. Google will misspell it. We'll spell it properly for you, even if I can't. And Jacob, who are you on Twitter?
I am bots are the letter R, so bots are people 2 TOO on Twitter. Robots are people 2 would not fit, which made me very sad.
I understand that the struggle is real, my friend. The struggle is real. So those are both good ways to reach us. You can also email us at superheroethics@gmail.com. For us, the best part of these conversations is getting to hear from you guys and getting to continue the conversations that way. Another thing I want to announce, I said last time that we were trying to get a Patreon set up. We do now have a Patreon set up. It is at patreon.com /superheroethics. Or if you just search for Superhero Ethics, patreon.com, you'll find it. Be sure you do have the podcast site. As I mentioned before, someone else has written a book called Superhero Ethics. That also has a Patreon site, but we have the actual Superhero Ethics on Patreon, so you can find us easily. There's so many other ways to support the podcast. We certainly don't expect it from anyone, but from anyone who does want to make that little donation, you can do as little as $1 an episode. It does a lot to help keep Jacob and I being able to do this in terms of the time spent and the technology. We're trying to upgrade some of our recording technology and things like that. And there's also some great rewards you can get. You can get thanks by us on the air. You can get some great merchandise like T-shirts and mouse pads and things like that. And even at the highest level, you get to help us plan an episode and basically suggest a topic that we'll do an episode on. So Patreon's a great way to support us. Just getting the word out to your friends, telling them about it, all those things we so greatly appreciate. Because more than anything, you guys, the fans, are what makes this show possible. So a huge thank you to the fans. Jacob, I know you want to throw a thank you out there.
I would like to thank Jack Hesse for the use of our intro and outro song. He is the composer of those two pieces of music. Thank you very much, Jack, for the use of those.
Yeah, they are both. You'll now notice that we now have outro music instead of just intro music. The two pieces kind of wonderfully complement each other, and I think do a lot to help this podcast. So thank you guys to the fans. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you so much to Jack, and on behalf of all of us, have a good day.